When something is good, it always leaves you wanting more. This is true of most things, but it is especially true with video games. A good game should make you want to keep playing even though the game is over. This is the main tenet of a good completion experience as well. However, this is not always the case. Sometimes what you got more of makes you feel worse. You may enjoy one Snickers, but if you eat a whole bunch, you could get sick. And if you keep playing a video game, you may get bored and frustrated with diminishing returns. You'll see what I mean when I recomplete Tiny Brains.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to an all-new episode of the Completionist New Game Plus, the show where I am recompleting the first 120 games I ever featured here on the channel. More on that in the box down below. Guys, Tiny Brains was a game that I grew up loving, mostly because of the fact that it was a game that was close to my heart because I met the developers and I formed a relationship with them. But because of that relationship, I was ridiculed when I first reviewed this game. So I thought, you know what? This time around, enough time has passed. I'm gonna give a fresh pair of eyes look at Tiny Brains. And those eyes are right here.
What are you doing?
CG the eyes in, please. 3D CG, whatever, a PNG, whatever works.
We're doing it in post.
Post. Editor, put the eyes in my hands. Let's begin.
While most conventions are famous for their insane booths featuring AAA titles, my favorite thing to do is to find the corner where all the indie games are kept. Yeah, they don't have the huge budget that companies like Nintendo or Bethesda would have, but they always seem to find a way to create fun and unique games with limited resources. It was on one of these searches back in 2013 where I discovered Tiny Brains. For me, it stood out from the crowd because of its unique design and fun cooperative gameplay. You and up to 3 other friends take control of 4 mutated mammals. They each have different psychic abilities and are forced to use said abilities to solve puzzles built at home by a deranged scientist. It's up to you to get all through the puzzles and try to escape from the scientist's lab. Alright, so this game obviously has a Portal vibe, and it works great here, and I definitely wanted more. Fortunately, I saw this game at multiple conventions and eventually became friends with the people at Spearhead Games, the studio that made Tiny Brains. Getting to know them easily made the game a personal favorite of mine from that part of my life. And I wanted the whole world to feel the same way. I was so passionate about Tiny Brains that I tweeted all about it during the conventions that I was at. I encouraged everyone I talked to go play Tiny Brains. And lo and behold, people played the game. I'm not saying I was the sole reason why their booth was busy, but I definitely had fans of mine come up to me and say, hey, I played this game and it was great, which is why I'm excited to revisit Tiny Brains today. It's always fun to look back at a game that you personally loved and see that other people felt the same way. This is an entertaining multiplayer experience that came out right when the PS4 did. There must have been a bunch of people who enjoyed this game as much as me, except there weren't. In fact, there doesn't seem to be anyone who remembers this game at all. While the reviews were decent overall, Tiny Brains sold so poorly that it was taken off the PlayStation Store, the way that I originally completed the game. But another kicker is that there really isn't anything out there about this game information-wise. There's not even a Wikipedia page talking about this game. This would make sense to me if this was some obscure title on the Atari back in the day, but this came out in 2013. The internet was definitely a thing back then. And this is a game that was completely forgotten about by everyone. I've heard more people talk about Scalar than Tiny Brains, which isn't fair because one is a genuinely fun puzzle platformer you can play with your friends, and the other is a random game I googled for a video about Gex. But I hope that today I will remedy this. I loved Tiny Brains when I first completed it on the PS4, and I know that it definitely deserves to be more remembered than frickin' Scalar. I already talked about how great the atmosphere was and how much Tiny Brains was with friends, but I didn't mention one of my biggest complaints. The original game was way too short. I completed Tiny Brains on the PS4 in about 4 to 5 hours. I limited how I wanted more content, and this time around, I'm playing the Steam version, which means I got more content. However, it made me realize that despite how short the core gameplay is, Tiny Brains has diminishing returns the more you play it. Now, it starts off really fun. The game has awesome design, and this is evident with the 4 rodents you start off with, aka the Tiny Brains. They somehow look adorable and grotesque at the same time, and this goes with the rest of the game as well. I love the hamsters that fly throughout the air with the congratulations sign every time you solve a puzzle. It makes you laugh while also causing you to sympathize with the Tiny Brains. It's a smart move. Each tiny brain has a unique ability that can be used to solve every puzzle. The rabbit can pull objects towards them, the bat can push objects away, the mouse can swap places with objects, and the hamster can create an icy platform to help to get to hard to reach areas. The great thing about all of these is that each one is just as useful as the other. Not one of these characters feels too broken. But the real joy here comes with playing with your friends. The first time I completed this game was partially on Super Beard Bros, and you can see how fun it is to play the game with everyone in a single room. This time, I did something a little bit different. I beat the story with the help of different fans I could get on my Twitch streams. And I was worried. It was going to be a lot harder to communicate with someone who was not physically next to me. And although it was a bit harder, it was still an absolute blast. It added a bit more chaos to the mix, which I adored. It felt just as fun as when I first played it. But like I mentioned earlier, the game is too short. It's only 4 levels long, and I finished them in about 2 hours. Not to mention that the ending was pretty anticlimactic. I could easily play this story for another 4 to 6 hours, but that's not what Spearhead Games decided to add. Instead, they added challenge levels. Throughout the story mode, you can find 5 pieces of cheese in each of the levels. If you find all 20, you will unlock the challenge levels. These are basically hardcore versions for all the different types of puzzles you solved throughout the main game. And this was very rough. While it gave me what I wanted with more levels, it removed a lot of what I loved about Tiny Brains. There were no more quips from the evil scientist. Instead of levels looking like they were built by hand with craft supplies, they looked all neon and generic. And each level was frustratingly difficult. And worst of all, they made me notice a lot of the game's flaws so much more. When I first featured this game on the channel, I mentioned there were some bugs and glitches, but they never ruined your enjoyment of the game. That's not true with these challenge levels. There were controller mishaps and times when the physics of the game just went wonky. And this is really important when you're trying to get a good rating for each challenge. Each of the challenge levels will rate you up to 3 stars based on how well you do. Often the difference between 2 stars and 3 stars will be a fraction of a second. And when the game glitches on you, you'll have to try them all over again and again, which means you'll experience this frustration process over again and again. This gets infuriating and not in a fun way. This easily added another 10 hours to my playthrough and left a bad taste in my mouth, which was bad because I still had 2 more playthroughs of the story mode to do. The first was with Tiny Troll mode. This is exactly the same as the regular game mode, except your powers work on the other players as well as objects, and you look like regular humans. It's essentially friendly fire, and it did add more fun to the chaos, but I missed the designs of the macabre mutants. The next was Jules mode. This features a 5th tiny brain, Jules. When you play this mode, you only control Jules, but they can use every single power in their arsenal that the other tiny brains had. And if you die once, it's game over. This turns the multiplayer mayhem into single player serenity. This mode is actually really hard because while you can rely on yourself to execute it, your powers have to be perfectly placed in order to make any progress. It definitely is harder than communicating with 4 friends, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. Not to mention that Jules looks kind of badass when they're introduced into the game. Easily the 3rd coolest Jules of all time, next to Vern and Winfield.
Say what again? Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you, motherfucker.
While there were challenges in the original PS4 version, they added a lot more to the Steam version. They added even a soccer mode so you can play soccer with your friends. But the big revelation I had this time around was noticing that I could see a lot of the threads that were not put together here very well. Imagine if you're at Disneyland, right? And you see Mickey Mouse and you can kind of tell that the suit that he's wearing is falling apart. That's kind of what Tiny Brains is. It's a physics demo packaged into a fun multiplayer experience. This was Spearhead Games' first game as a new studio. They've gone on to make a bunch of other great games since then, but it all started with Tiny Brains. In the end, the entire process of recompleting Tiny Brains was a bit of a surprise to me. The extra content that was there in the Steam version was exciting, and I was excited for it, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. The more I played the game, the more bored I got until I came back to what drew me in the first place. I guess sometimes you don't need to eat a whole meal. An appetizer is just enough. The only in-game true bonus you get is Jules mode. Everything else is just an achievement on Steam or PS4, but they feature the names of great minds from history, like Tolstoy or Wayne Gretzky, and completing Jules mode does the same thing, but there's something different about it. Something familiar. Something bearded. That's right. I am the final achievement. When you complete Jules mode, the hardest mode in the game, you get my face as that beautiful achievement. Now, I said it once before back in the original video, but I want to give another big thank you to the gang over at Spearhead Games. I'm truly honored to be featured here. I hope you guys are all doing well, and honestly, I haven't spoken to you in years, but just to let you know, Tiny Brains brought people joy, despite its reviews. But other than my ego being properly stroked, how am I feeling at the end of all of this? Honestly, I feel alright. Playing through the whole story with random people online was a ton of fun, and Jules Mode was a nice cherry on top to the whole experience. But when I played this game all those years ago, I didn't have to do all of these insane extra challenges. They were tough, a lot tougher than I expected with my past experience with this game. There isn't really a reward in finishing them, and they took all of the really cool look from the story mode and got rid of it. The extra challenge levels left me dissatisfied. Now, this game is still a ton of fun to play, especially if you're playing with people who you love to play games with, but there's not really a need to perfect everything here in this game. When I recompleted Tiny Brains, there were countless deaths. This game is all about trial and error, so you're going to die a lot. Just embrace it. 4 different chapters cleared very quickly. 20 pieces of cheese collected. These were just as easy as the last time, but I admit, because there's not really a whole lot of information out there, I forgot where most of the major locations were. 60 stars earned from playing every single challenge and getting the maximum rating. While fun at first, this time they definitely started to outstay their welcome. 16 hours of total playtime, and 1 achievement that perfectly reflects my intelligence level. That's right, I'm smarter than Nikolai Tesla, Ivan Pavlov, and Alexander Mihailovich Astaven. At least that's how I pronounce it. I don't know, I'm not smart with names, I'm smart with games, okay?
Even though a lot of Tiny Brains' cracks started to show all these years later, I still had a fun time with it. I love the atmosphere, the story mode, and playing with a group of people is fantastic, even with total strangers. It makes me sad that this game is pretty much forgotten nowadays. I feel that with a little refinement and a lot more story content, this game could have been an indie classic. Even without that, this game is absolutely worth a visit if you're just hanging out with your buddies and want several hours to kill. Now, originally, I believe I gave this game my rating of completed, and looking back at that now, that is a little bit biased for one big reason. My face is the freaking trophy when you complete the game, both on Steam and on PS4 back in the day. Nowadays, do I agree with that sentiment? I'm not so sure. And a lot of that relies on the quality of the game and the amount of content that's here. So the completionist in me says complete it. But the person in me playing this game again for the second time in a row in my life, I give this game my completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!